Is this Daddy? Those 3 words, soft, uncertain, soaked in tears, hit Damien Voss like a fist to the sternum. He went completely still. The man who had once held a rival crime lord at gunpoint without his heart rate climbing above 60. The man whose name made debt collectors hang up the phone first. The man with ink crawling up his neck and a jaw carved like it was designed to intimidate. That man stood frozen behind his mahogany desk, staring at the cracked phone screen, at the tiny face filling it, and felt something inside his chest detonate quietly. She was maybe 3 years old, dark curly hair, a little plastic barrette sliding sideways out of it, round cheeks shining wet with tears, and eyes. His eyes. That specific shade of near black that his mother once called trouble eyes, because nothing got past them. Those eyes were looking directly into the camera, red-rimmed and wide, with the kind of trust that only children and fools extend to strangers. She was holding the phone in both hands the way toddlers do, gripped like it might escape. And behind her, filling the background of that small, peeling-walled apartment, were 2 men, large, loud, leather jackets. One of them was pointing a finger in a woman's face, the other had his hand on her arm. Damien's jaw tightened. He hadn't recognized the incoming call. Unknown number. He'd almost sent it to voicemail. He was in the middle of a meeting, 3 of his lieutenants sitting across the desk from him. But something made him glance down, and something else made him answer. Now he couldn't look away. "Is this Daddy?" she asked again, quieter this time, as if she was afraid the answer might be no. The 3 men sitting across from Damien Voss watched their boss, a man none of them had ever seen flinch at anything, go the color of chalk. He didn't answer the child right away. He was doing the math. 4 years. That's how long it had been since Nadia Reeves had vanished from his life. No call, no note, he believed. Just gone like smoke, like she had never existed, except that she had completely and entirely, and he had spent 4 years trying to locate her and arriving, every single time, at a dead end that felt deliberately constructed. 4 years ago. And this child was 3 years old. The math was not complicated. "Mister?" the little girl whispered. Her bottom lip was trembling. "The men are being mean to Mama." Every person in that office felt the temperature drop. Damien set down his pen. He looked at his lieutenants with an expression that emptied the room in under 10 seconds. The door closed. Silence. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, and spoke into the phone with the particular quiet that people who knew him understood was far more dangerous than shouting. "What's your name?" "Ava," she said. "Ava." He repeated it once to himself, like he was learning a word in a new language. "Ava, I need you to turn the phone around and show me the men." She did it immediately, with the complete solemn cooperation of a child who has decided to trust you. The camera swung. Damien got 3 full seconds of the 2 debt collectors, their faces, their jackets, the agency logo on the folder one of them was holding. He recognized the company. He knew exactly who they worked for and exactly what kind of loans they collected on. He also saw Nadia, still in her diner uniform. Hair pulled back, one strand loose across her face. She looked exhausted in the specific way that years of exhaustion looks. Not just tired, but hollowed, like she'd been running on empty so long she'd forgotten what full felt like. She was clutching a paper in both hands, and her knuckles were white, and she was not looking at the men. She was looking at Ava, with a terror that had nothing to do with the debt. She had seen what Ava was doing with the phone. Her eyes went to the screen. She saw the face on it, and Nadia Reeves, who had survived 4 years alone with no safety net and no help and no one, went absolutely still. Damien looked at her for one long moment across 4 years and a cracked phone screen. Then he looked back at the debt collectors. His voice, when it came, was conversational, almost pleasant. "Gentlemen, you have 30 seconds to remove your hands from that woman and step outside. After that, I stop being polite." The room froze. One of the collectors, the one holding the folder, squinted at the phone screen. His face changed. He knew that face. Everyone in their industry knew that face. The kind of knowing that lives in your stomach, not your head. He took one step back, then another. "Sir, we're just here to collect on a legitimate 20 seconds, Damien said. They left. They didn't even pick up the folder. The apartment was suddenly completely quiet. Ava lowered the phone, turned it back around, and looked at the screen with her red-rimmed, too wise eyes. "They're gone," she reported. "Good girl," Damien said, and then, because she had asked him a question and she deserved an answer, "Ava, I'm going to come there, okay? Don't let anyone in until I arrive." She considered this with the gravity of a small person making a large decision. Then she nodded. "Okay, Daddy," she said, simply, like she'd decided. "But I'm moving too fast, because to understand how a 3-year-old's video call could detonate 4 years of silence and lies and carefully constructed walls, you need to understand what came before it. You need to know about Nadia Reeves, a woman who took a $14,000 predatory loan when her newborn daughter was sick and the hospital bills were drowning her, who worked double shifts at a diner and still sometimes chose between groceries and electricity, who received a letter 4 years ago that she believed with her whole heart and that destroyed her life. You need to know what that letter said and who really wrote it and why. And you need to understand Damien Voss, not the version the underworld tells stories about, but the version that stood in a silent office just now doing arithmetic about a child's age and felt the armor he'd been wearing for 4 years develop a crack it would never fully close. A toddler with a sideways barrette and her father's eyes picked up a phone today. She didn't know she was changing everything. She only knew that Mama was scared and she wanted to help. That's the whole story, really. Right there. Everything else is just what happened because of it. If you've ever watched someone you love carry a weight they should never have carried alone, stay with me, because what happens in the next chapter will break something in you, and then, carefully and completely, it will put it back. Hit, like if you believe the right person can still find their way home. Share this with someone who needed to hear it today. And subscribe, because the story of Damien Voss learning to be worthy of the word daddy is just getting started. 3 hours before that phone call, the apartment on Garfield Street was the kind of quiet that feels less like peace and more like held breath. Nadia Reeves pushed through the door at 10:47 p.m., still in her uniform. Black polo, black apron, the faint permanent smell of fried food that no amount of washing fully removed. Her feet ached with the specific, a bone-deep pain of 8 hours on concrete floors in shoes that had been worn past their useful life by about 6 months. She'd been meaning to replace them. She'd been meaning to do a lot of things. The apartment greeted her with the glow of the nightlight she always left on for Ava. The little girl was asleep on the pull-out couch. They shared it, had since Ava was born, because the apartment had only one room, and Nadia had never been able to justify the expense of a second piece of furniture when there were always more urgent things to spend money on. Ava was sprawled sideways the way toddlers sleep, one arm thrown over her stuffed rabbit, dark curls covering half her face, barrette still somehow clinging on by one tooth. Nadia stood in the doorway and looked at her daughter for a long moment. She was exhausted down to something deeper than her bones, but she did this every night, stood here, just for 30 seconds, and let herself feel the one uncomplicated thing in her life, the one thing that had never asked her to be stronger than she was. Ava didn't know about the $14,000. Ava didn't know that the loan company had called 4 times this week. Ava didn't know that the final notice that arrived yesterday meant that 2 men were going to knock on their door tomorrow, and Nadia didn't have the money and didn't have a plan and didn't have anyone to call. Ava knew that Mama smelled like syrup sometimes and gave good hugs and made shapes out of scrambled eggs on Saturday mornings. That's enough, Nadia told herself. That has to be enough. She moved quietly to the kitchen. The refrigerator held 2 eggs, a near-empty bottle of milk, some leftover rice, and a block of cheese she was rationing. She'd skip breakfast again tomorrow. Ava wouldn't notice as long as her own plate was full. She opened the cabinet above the stove to reach for a glass, and that's when she saw it. The box. She didn't mean to look at it. She looked at it anyway. A shoebox. Nondescript. Pushed to the very back of the highest shelf behind a rarely used pot. She'd put it there 3 years ago, when Ava started pulling herself up on furniture and reaching for things. She'd needed it somewhere, small hands couldn't find it. Inside the box, a single photograph. A letter she had read so many times the fold lines were white. A phone number written on a torn piece of paper in handwriting that was not hers. She'd kept the number because she couldn't make herself destroy it. She'd kept the photograph for the same reason she'd kept breathing, not because it felt good, but because some things are simply impossible to stop doing. She closed the cabinet. She went to bed. She did not sleep. At 7:14 the next morning, while Nadia was in the shower with the water turned low to save hot water, Ava woke up. She was a child who woke up curious. She padded to the kitchen in her socks, saw the phone on the counter, Mama's phone, screen lit with a missed call notification from a number labeled Final Notice, and climbed onto the stool to look at it the way she often did, scrolling through the photos of herself she liked to find. She scrolled past the photos. She went somewhere else. She wasn't sure later how she found it, whether she pressed something she shouldn't have or whether 3-year-old fingers are simply braver than adult ones. But she found the contact, a star emoji, no name. There was a photo attached to it, a man, dark hair combed back neat, a strong face, tattoos on his neck and hands, sitting behind a very big desk, looking at the camera like he owned whatever room he was in. Ava had seen this picture before. She'd asked Mama once who it was, and Mama had gone very quiet and said someone who can't be with us, in the voice she used when a subject was closed. Ava looked at the picture for a long time. Then the front door rattled. Hard. The knock that followed it was not polite. Nadia came out of the shower in a towel, face pale, because she had known this knock was coming, and knowing hadn't made it easier. She told Ava to sit on the couch and not move. She opened the door. The 2 men filled the frame. They came in without being invited. They started talking about the debt, the $14,000 plus interest plus fees plus the cost of this visit, invoices designed to make a person feel small. Nadia knew her rights. She'd looked them up carefully, late at night on the library computer. But knowing your rights and being able to enforce them at 7:30 in the morning, while 2 large men stand in your living room, are different things. She was scared. Ava could see that she was scared. Ava looked at the phone in her hand. She looked at the picture of the man with the tattoos. She looked at her mother. She pressed call. She didn't know what she was doing exactly. She knew that Mama looked the way she looked when things were very bad. She knew the man in the picture was something important, the kind of important that made Mama go quiet. She knew that when things were very bad, you called someone. The phone rang twice. The face appeared on the screen, and Ava Reeves, 3 years old, looked at Damien Voss for the first time in her short life and asked the question that had been living in her chest since she was old enough to notice that other children had something she didn't. "Is this Daddy?" The debt collectors didn't know they were about to become the least powerful people in the room. They were about to find out. Damien's men arrived in 11 minutes. He knew because he was still on the call when the black SUV pulled up outside the building. He could see it in the background of the screen, through the thin curtain that didn't quite cover the window. 3 men got out. They didn't run. They didn't need to. Men who work for Damien Voss have learned that the most effective way to communicate urgency is to move like nothing in the world can stop you, because nothing can. He heard the knock at the apartment door through the phone. He heard Nadia's sharp intake of breath. Then he heard one of his men, Cole by the voice, say 4 words through the door. Just 4. He didn't catch them, but he watched one of the debt collectors turn toward the sound, and then watched the other one look at his partner, and then watched both of them pick up their folder from the floor and leave without saying goodbye to Nadia, and without looking at Ava, and without another single word about the $14,000 or the interest or the cost of the visit. The door closed. Ava turned the phone back around. She looked at the screen with an expression of profound 3-year-old satisfaction, like a person who had correctly identified the solution to a problem. "They went away," she said. "They did," Damien said. "Good job." She appeared to consider whether this compliment was warranted, decided it was, and nodded seriously. Behind her, he could see Nadia standing very still in the center of the room, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the space where the men had been. She hadn't looked at the phone again. She was doing what people do when they've been bracing for impact for so long that the sudden absence of it doesn't feel like relief. It just feels like waiting for the next thing. "Ava," Damien said carefully, "can you give the phone to your mama?" Ava looked over her shoulder at Nadia, then she looked back at the screen. Then she walked to her mother and held the phone up, the way you offer someone something important. Nadia looked down at it. She looked at the screen. For a long moment, she and Damien existed in that strange, suspended space of a video call. Him behind the desk in his dark suit, her in her diner uniform in the apartment. 3 years of carefully maintained distance suddenly reduced to the width of a phone screen, and 4 years of questions neither of them had answered. She reached out. She took the phone from Ava's hand. She ended the call. He arrived in 53 minutes. He'd made calls in the car, the first to Cole, to confirm the collectors were gone and to stay on the block until further notice. The second to his attorney, brief. "I just a name." The loan company name from the folder he'd clocked on the call, and the instruction to find out everything there was to know about them before morning. His attorney had learned not to ask why. He stood outside the apartment door on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like old carpet and other people's cooking, and he knocked. Not the way the collectors had knocked. Knuckles, twice, quiet, silence from inside. He waited. "Nadia," he said it to the door. "I know you're standing right on the other side of this. You don't have to open it, but I'm not leaving." More silence, then the particular silence of a decision being made. The lock turned. She opened the door 4 inches and looked at him through the gap, with an expression he had never seen on her face in the 3 years he'd known her before she disappeared. It was the expression of a person who had used up every reserve of trust they had and was being asked to spend from an account that was empty. She looked terrible, and she looked beautiful, and she looked like she hadn't slept properly in 4 years, which, he was beginning to understand, was probably accurate. "You need to go," she said. "She called me," he said. "That means something." Something moved across Nadia's face. Pain, maybe. Or recognition. Or the specific agony of a thing you've been protecting against arriving anyway, inevitable, at your door. The gap widened. She stepped back. He walked in. The apartment was smaller than he'd expected, and he'd expected small. He was not a man given to sentimentality. He had spent 20 years building an empire that required him to observe everything and feel nothing about most of it. But he stood in the doorway of that apartment and felt something move through him that he didn't have a clean word for. The couch had a sheet tucked over it, the sleeping arrangement he understood for both of them. A small television with a crack across the lower corner of the screen sat on a plastic storage bin. The kitchen table had 2 chairs and a third that didn't match. On the wall above the couch was a gallery of crayon drawings, taped up carefully, each one a small world. Houses, suns, dogs, a figure with dark hair and a large square body that appeared repeatedly with no context. He looked at that figure for a moment. The refrigerator door was held shut with a rubber band looped around the handle. The window above the kitchen sink had a draft coming through it that made the thin curtain move even with the window closed. On the counter, a plastic folder of papers, bills, by the look of them, held together with a binder clip, the kind of organization that emerges when the paperwork of hardship becomes too large to ignore. And on the shelf in the corner, framed cheaply but framed, a photograph. Nadia, visibly pregnant, standing somewhere outdoors. She was laughing at whoever was taking the picture, laughing the way she used to, before whatever had happened, with her whole face. She had kept it. Through 4 years of whatever this had been, she had kept it and put it in a frame and kept it on the shelf where she would see it every day. He looked away from it before she noticed him looking. Ava had stationed herself on the couch and was watching him with the focused intensity of a child conducting a serious assessment. She had retrieved her stuffed rabbit and was holding it in front of her like a shield that she wasn't actually using as a shield. She was curious Curiosity was winning over caution, but only barely. Damien pulled out the mismatched third chair and sat down at the kitchen table. Nadia stood by the counter with her arms folded. She had the posture of someone who has decided not to run, but hasn't decided what to do instead. He asked her one question. "Why did you leave?" The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Nadia looked at him for a long moment, measuring something or deciding something, or both. Then she turned to Ava. "Baby, can you go play in the corner with your books for a few minutes? Mama needs to talk." Ava considered this negotiation. She looked at Damien. She looked at her rabbit. She climbed off the couch with the rabbit under one arm and walked to the corner where a small basket of board books sat beside a folded blanket, and she sat down with her back to the wall so she could still see both of them clearly. Nadia watched this and did not have the energy to argue about it. She went to the plastic folder on the counter. She pulled out an envelope from behind the bills, older than the other papers, handled more, the edges soft with age. She set it on the table in front of Damien. He looked at it. Then he picked it up and took out the letter inside. It was on letterhead he recognized because it was his, the insignia at the top, the address, the formal structure. All of it accurate, all of it the kind of detail a person couldn't fake without being very close to the source. The handwriting was close to his. And not perfect, but close enough for a woman who was frightened and pregnant and receiving it from the hands of a man she'd been told to trust. The letter was brief, clinical. It told Nadia Reeves that she had been a personal indulgence and a professional liability, that continuing any association with Damien Voss would result in consequences for her and anyone close to her, that the appropriate response was to take the enclosed cash and relocate and cease all contact permanently. At the bottom, his signature, or something very near to it. He read it twice. The second time he was looking specifically at the signature, studying the particular way the letters connected, the angle of the final stroke. Close, practiced. The work of someone who had seen his signature enough times to replicate it under pressure, someone inside. Someone with access to the letterhead and the address and the structure of official correspondence and enough knowledge of Nadia's situation to know the threat would land. He set the letter down. His expression did not change. People who had known Damien Voss for years could tell you that this, the absolute stillness of his face, was the most dangerous version of him. Anger showed on people, coldness showed on people. This was something beyond both of those things. This was a man filing information away in a place where it would be retrieved later, precisely and completely. His hands on the table were very still. "I didn't write this," he said. Nadia looked at him. "I know what you're going to say," he said before she could. "You're going to say that's exactly what someone who wrote it would tell you. I understand that. I'm not asking you to believe me right now. I'm telling you the truth and I'll prove it. But that takes time and you don't have to give me that time tonight." He paused. "I didn't know you were pregnant. I didn't know about Ava. If I had known, nothing in this world would have kept me away from you." Nadia's jaw moved. She was not going to cry in front of him. He could see the decision being made and held. "Someone in your organization forged that letter," she said. Her voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when they've been through enough, that steadiness becomes a survival mechanism. "Someone who wanted me gone." "Yes," he said, "and I'm going to find out who." The refrigerator hummed. From her corner, Ava turned a page in her board book, the thick cardboard sound of it small and ordinary in the heavy room. What Nadia didn't say then, what she would tell him weeks later, when enough had happened to make saying it survivable, was what the months after that letter had actually looked like. How she'd discovered the pregnancy alone, in a gas station bathroom, on a test she'd bought with the last of the cash from the envelope. How she'd taken that cash and stretched it across 8 months of rent and groceries and prenatal vitamins, because she was too afraid to go anywhere near anyone from her former life, which meant no support, no familiarity, nothing. How Ava had been born 6 weeks early and spent 11 days in the NICU, and Nadia had sat beside the incubator in a hospital gown and watched her daughter breathe through a tube and understood for the first time in her life what it meant to be completely, utterly alone. How she'd taken the loan, $8,000 at first for the medical bills, from a company that advertised on a flyer in the hospital waiting room. Emergency funds, same-day approval, no credit check required. She hadn't understood, not fully, what the interest terms meant in practice. She was 24 years old and exhausted, and her daughter was in an incubator and the paperwork was thick, and the representative was friendly and she'd signed it. By the time Ava was 1, the $8,000 had grown to $11,000 with fees and penalties, and a compounding rate she hadn't fully understood when she'd signed. By the time Ava was 2, it was $14,000. The company sent friendly letters that became firm letters that became the 2 men in leather jackets this morning. What those men had done this morning, entering without a warrant, using physical intimidation, or implying consequences that no legitimate debt collector is legally permitted to imply, was a violation of the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act in at least 4 separate ways. Damien's attorney would identify all 4 by morning, along with 3 additional violations in the original loan contract's terms, including an interest rate that exceeded the legal cap in the state by 9 percentage points. None of that information would undo the 4 years. None of it would give Nadia back the nights she'd lain awake doing arithmetic about whether she could afford both electricity and food this week. None of it would unexhaust her. But it would mean that the $14,000 was not what it had been represented as. It would mean that Nadia Reeves had not been defeated by her own failure. She had been targeted, first by the person who forged that letter and stripped away her safety net, and then by a company that specialized in finding people exactly like her, alone, afraid, without resources, without anyone in their corner. She had been alone in that corner for 4 years. She was not alone in it anymore. Damien Voss folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Then he looked across the small kitchen table at the mother of his child and said, very quietly, "Tell me everything, from the beginning. I'm not going anywhere." From her corner, Ava looked up from her book. She studied the big man with the tattoos sitting at her kitchen table. She studied her mama. She looked back at her book. Then she got up, walked across the room. Diane climbed into the empty chair beside Damien. She didn't say anything. She just opened her book in her lap and resumed reading, as if this were perfectly normal, as if she had decided something and the decision was already done. Nadia watched her daughter settle in beside the man who was either the answer to 4 years of questions or the beginning of a new kind of danger, and she didn't know yet which one it was. But she sat down, and she started to talk. The investigation took 6 days. It felt longer than that, and shorter. Damien didn't announce it. He didn't hold a meeting or make declarations or let anyone in his organization know that he was pulling threads. He had learned over 20 years of operating in a world where trust was both the most valuable currency and the most frequently counterfeited one, that the moment you tell people you're looking for a leak is the moment the leak disappears. So he said nothing. He went about his week with the same cold efficiency that his people had come to expect from him, sat through the same meetings, made the same calls, signed the same documents, and in the background, quietly and completely, he started pulling threads. The letterhead was the first one. His official correspondence paper was stored in one place, a locked cabinet in his personal office, managed by exactly 3 people: his assistant, his attorney, and Marcus Holt, who had served as his chief lieutenant for 6 years and whose access to every level of Damien's operation was as broad as anyone alive. Damien cross-referenced the paper stock against the letter Nadia had kept. Same weight, same watermark, same cream color that had been discontinued by the supplier 2 years ago, which meant the letter had been written from paper pulled from that cabinet at least 2 years back. Probably 4. The signature was the second thread. Damien had a particular way of writing the V in his name, the right stroke longer than the left, a habit from a teacher in 7th grade who'd told him his handwriting looked like a threat and he'd never bothered to correct it. The signature on the forged letter got it almost right. Left stroke longer. Practiced enough to fool someone unfamiliar with the original. Not practiced enough to fool Damien himself, who had been writing his name the same wrong right way for 30 years. Marcus had seen his signature thousands of times. Marcus had also, Damien now recalled, spent a period of 3 weeks 4 years ago handling all outgoing correspondence while Damien was managing a situation overseas. 3 weeks of signing Damien's name to documents under authorization. 3 weeks of practice. The third thread was the timing. Nadia had received the letter during those exact 3 weeks. He confirmed this by checking her account of the date against his own travel records, which his attorney kept archived. It aligned perfectly. A perfect window, clean and deliberate, chosen by someone who understood schedules and access and the mechanics of a plan that had to hold for years without unraveling. On the 6th day, Damien sat in his office after everyone had gone and looked at the 3 threads laid out in front of him. Not literally. They existed only in the precise architecture of his own mind, and let the name settle into place. Marcus Holt. He stayed with that for a long time. 6 years was a long time. Long enough to build something that felt like loyalty so completely that you stopped checking the foundations. Marcus had been with him through 3 dangerous territorial shifts, 2 federal investigations that went nowhere, and the kind of years that forge men into something. Damien had trusted him the way you trust a structure you helped build, automatically, without testing it every time you walked through. The structure had been rotten in one specific place for 4 years, and a woman had been alone in a gas station bathroom reading a pregnancy test, and a child had grown up on a pull-out couch because of it. Damien picked up his phone. He sent a single message to Cole. "Find out where Marcus is this week. Don't tell him I asked." Then he put the phone down and sat in the quiet, and felt, very carefully, the thing he was going to do with this information. He had options. He knew what they were. He had exercised most of them at various points over the past 20 years, but something had shifted in the calculus this week, and he was still getting used to what that meant. The thing that had shifted had dark, curly hair and a sideways barrette. He had been going to the apartment every day. He hadn't planned it that way. The first visit had been necessary. He'd needed to hear Nadia's account, assess the situation, take the letter. The second visit had been to bring his attorney, a measured and unflappable woman named Sylvia Chen, who had been unraveling bad legal situations for Damien's people for 11 years, and who looked at Nadia's loan documents for 20 minutes, and then said in a tone that suggested this was not the most offensive thing she'd seen this week, but was trying, "This contract is a document of fiction. Give me 10 days. Nadia had looked at Sylvia with the expression of someone being told the locked room they'd been in for years had a door that opened from the inside, and they were only now being shown the handle. Sylvia had explained it with the patience of someone who knew that explaining was part of the job. The loan company had charged an interest rate that exceeded the state's legal cap by nearly 9 points. They had failed to provide the legally required disclosure forms at signing. The collectors who had come to the apartment had violated federal law in 4 specific ways: the physical intimidation, the failure to provide written validation of the debt upon entry, the implied threats, and the misrepresentation of legal consequences. All of it documented, all of it actionable. Not just a defense, Sylvia said, a counterattack. They could pursue the loan company for damages. I didn't know I could do that, Nadia said. Most people don't, Sylvia said. That's how these companies stay in business. That was the 3rd visit. The 4th visit Damien didn't have a reason for. He had been in the car heading to a meeting on the other side of the city, and he'd found himself on Garfield Street instead, and he'd parked, and he'd sat in the car for a moment having a conversation with himself that he lost. And he'd knocked on the door. Nadia had opened it with the look of a woman recalibrating a boundary she'd tried to draw. But Ava had appeared at her mother's elbow, seen him, and said, "The big man is back," with an air of complete approval, and that had settled the question. The big man. That was what she called him. Not in the way that children sometimes name things with innocent cruelty. She said it with a kind of respect, the way you might refer to someone with a title you haven't learned the proper word for yet. He was the big man. He sat on her kitchen floor. He had not yet been tested, but he was passing her current assessments. On the fourth visit, she showed him her drawings, not the whole wall. She curated the tour, on choosing specific pieces and explaining them with the focused seriousness of a small person who has given a lot of thought to their own work. This one was a house with a yellow door. This one was a dog she wanted. This one was a picture of Mama making eggs. This one was the drawing she called My Family, which was, Damien observed with his chest doing something complicated, 4 figures, one large and dark-haired and angular, in a way that a 3-year-old interpreted as blocky. "Who's this one?" he asked, pointing at the large figure. Ava looked at it. Then she looked at him. Then she looked back at it. She didn't answer. She moved on to the next drawing. He let her. On the 5th visit, she asked him about the tattoos. She had been studying his hands for several days. He'd noticed, the way he noticed everything, and cataloging it and leaving it alone. This time, she reached out and very gently, with one small finger, traced the edge of the design that crossed his knuckles. "What's this?" she asked. "A drawing," he said. She looked at it seriously. "On your hand?" "On my hand." "Why?" He considered this. "I forgot to use paper." Ava stared at him. The stare lasted long enough that he thought she was about to give him a very direct assessment of this explanation. Then something cracked open in her face, the particular delight of a child who has encountered something so genuinely absurd that the only possible response is joy. And she laughed. Fully, completely, the way only small children laugh, with her whole body, and no reservations. And Damien looked at her laughing and felt something in the center of his chest that he did not have a name for and that was not going away. He noted, somewhere in the back of his mind, that he should find someone to write and illustrate a children's book about a man who forgot to use paper. He was not sure how one commissioned a children's book. He would find out. From the kitchen doorway, Nadia was watching. She had been watching all week with the careful attention of someone conducting a very important experiment whose results they are not yet ready to trust. She watched him sit on the linoleum floor with his suit jacket on and let Ava tape one of her drawings to his lapel. She watched him accept a plastic cup of pretend tea with the gravity of someone attending an actual meeting. She watched him listen. And this was the thing she noticed most, because Damien Voss was a man people listened to, not a man who listened, and yet he listened to Ava with his complete attention, asked her follow-up questions, did not look at his phone. She was not ready to forgive him. She was clear on that. There was 4 years of architecture in her chest that did not come down just because the reasons for it had been built on a lie. She had structured herself around that letter. She had made decisions, sacrifices, whole chapters of her life in response to what that letter told her was true. Finding out it wasn't true didn't undo the chapters. It just made them unbearable in a new way. But the wall was doing something it hadn't been doing a week ago. It was the pretend tea that had started it. She had watched this man, whose name alone was enough to clear a room, who had sat across from her at this kitchen table and been still in a way that frightened her more than anger would have, accept a plastic teacup from a 3-year-old and say, "Thank you, that's very good," with complete sincerity. And something in the wall had moved just slightly, like a stone shifted by water. Nothing dramatic, just a shift. She didn't tell him that. She wouldn't, not yet. But she stopped telling him the visits needed to end. Marcus Holt learned on the 5th day that Damien was asking questions about the letter. He didn't learn it from anyone who knew they were telling him. He learned it the way careful men learn things, sideways, through the movement of other people and the specific quality of silences that had changed. Damien had asked the paper supplier about the discontinued stock. Someone at the supplier knew someone who knew Marcus. By the time the information traveled the 2 degrees back to him, it arrived as something innocuous sounding that Marcus's finely tuned sense of self-preservation translated immediately into its correct meaning. Damien was at the thread, and Damien was very, very good at threads. Marcus sat with this for approximately 2 hours. He was a man of calculation. That was why he'd been good at his job, why he'd risen as far as he had, why Damien had trusted him with everything. He ran the options the way you run numbers, systematically, eliminating the ones that didn't hold. He couldn't destroy the letter. Damien clearly already had it. He couldn't credibly deny the access, the timing, the signature. The evidence was either already assembled or close enough to assembled that the distance didn't matter. The only variable that remained in play was Nadia herself. She was the one who could testify to receiving it. She was the one who remembered the man who had delivered it, a detail Marcus had counted on her never being able to use because she had no reason to resurface and every reason to stay hidden. That calculation had held for 4 years. It had stopped holding the moment a 3-year-old picked up a phone. If Nadia was no longer available to corroborate the story, if she was relocated, frightened back into silence, or simply gone, then what Damien had was circumstantial. Paper stock and a signature and a timeline, damaging but arguable. Defensible, perhaps, into a man who had been loyal for 6 years and whose narrative had not yet been openly challenged. Marcus made his decision the way he always made decisions, quickly, cleanly, without letting himself feel the weight of it. He picked up his phone and made a call to someone he used for situations that required a particular kind of resolution. He explained what he needed. He gave Nadia's address. He'd had it since the 3rd day, because men like Marcus always know where people are, just in case. He said, "Make sure she understands that some doors, once closed, are better left that way." He meant it as a warning. He told himself it was only a warning. But Marcus Holt had spent 6 years working for a man who had never once directed his power toward a woman and a child, and he had mistaken that restraint for a limit. He didn't understand, not yet, that there is a difference between a man who chooses not to do something and a man who cannot. Damien had always chosen. He had never been tested on the other side of that choice. He was about to be. And Marcus, who prided himself on reading people, had made the last miscalculation of his career. Because the thing he'd feared 4 years ago, that Nadia would make Damien soft, had not happened. What had happened was considerably more dangerous than soft. What had happened was that a 3-year-old girl had laughed at a joke about tattoos and paper, and Damien Voss had looked at her laughing and quietly, irrevocably, decided what he was willing to do. The answer was anything. Cole called at 7:42 in the morning. Damien was already awake. He had not slept well, which was unusual for him, and he had spent the early hours of the morning sitting at his desk with coffee going cold beside him and the forged letter in front of him and the particular stillness of a man who has made a decision and is waiting for the world to catch up to it. When his phone rang and Cole's name appeared, he answered before the second ring. Cole said 4 words. "They're going for Ava." The cold that moved through Damien in that moment was different from the cold he usually carried. The cold he usually carried was a tool, controlled, directed, useful. This was something else. This was the cold of a man discovering a line he didn't know he had until someone stepped across it. He was in the car in under 2 minutes. Cole had picked it up through a contact inside Marcus's network, a man who had been quietly cooperative with Cole for several months, in exchange for considerations that didn't need to be detailed. The plan was simple in the way that bad plans are simple. 2 men, the daycare on Clement Street where Nadia dropped Ava every morning, sometime between 9 and 10 when the morning rush had cleared and the street was quieter. Not a permanent solution. A message. Take the child, make a call, tell Nadia that the city she was living in had become very dangerous for a woman with a small daughter, and that the healthy choice was to collect what she had and go. Marcus had told himself it was only a warning. Damien had known men like Marcus for 20 years, and he understood exactly what only a warning meant when a child was involved. It meant Marcus was still calculating, still treating people as variables, still operating in the framework where everything was negotiable and everyone had a price, and the right amount of pressure applied to the right point produced the desired result. He had miscalculated the desired result, and he had catastrophically miscalculated the pressure point. Damien called Nadia from the car. She answered on the 3rd ring, voice already tight. She'd had a missed call from the daycare, something about a disturbance on the street outside, and she was pulling on her jacket with one hand and holding the phone with the other. "Stay inside," Damien said. "Lock your door. I have people coming to you right now. Do not open it for anyone until you hear from Cole directly." "What's happening?" "Nadia." He said her name the way you say something to make a person focus. "I will handle it. Trust me for 10 minutes. A silence. The particular silence of a woman deciding whether 10 minutes of trust was something she had left to give. 10 minutes, she said, and hung up. He arrived at the daycare on Clement Street at 8:19 a.m. His car pulled up from the north end of the block. Cole was already there, parked across the street with 2 others, having come from the south. The daycare was a converted ground floor unit with a painted mural on the exterior wall, cartoon animals, bright colors, a sun with a face, and a short front path lined with a low wooden fence. The morning drop-off crowd had thinned. The street was quiet, the way Marcus had intended it to be. Marcus's car arrived from the east at 8:23. It parked half a block down. 2 men got out. They were not subtle. Men on this kind of errand are rarely subtle because subtlety is for operations that are meant to be permanent, and this was meant to be seen. They started walking toward the daycare entrance. They stopped when they saw Damien. He was standing in the middle of the path between the street and the front door, in his dark suit with his hands at his sides. Not moving, not speaking, just present, in the specific way that Damien Voss was present when he wanted you to understand the full weight of what you were attempting. The 2 men looked at each other. Then they looked at Cole's car. Then at the 2 men standing beside Cole's car. The arithmetic of the situation completed itself quickly. Marcus's car window came down. Marcus was in the passenger seat. He'd come himself, which told Damien something about how seriously he'd taken the operation, or perhaps about how badly he'd needed to see it work. He looked at Damien on the path, and something crossed his face that was not quite fear, but was the immediate neighbor of it. Damien looked at the car for a long moment. 20 years. That was the length of what he was looking at. 20 years of an organization he had built with a particular kind of ruthlessness, and Marcus had been inside it for 6 of them, and every instinct Damien had developed across those 20 years was telling him the same thing in the same clear voice it always used. It was the voice that had served him well. The voice that had kept him standing when other men in his position had fallen. It was telling him exactly how to end this, right here, on a street with a cartoon mural and a low wooden fence, in a way that would be fast and final and would not require a single phone call to anyone. He knew how to do it. He had done it before. The knowledge was in his hands and his jaw and the particular way he was standing. He was going to do it. And then the front door of the daycare opened. The teacher, young, ponytail, visibly distressed by the cars and the men and the quality of the atmosphere on her front path, had done the right thing and moved the children to the back room. She was coming out to assess the situation herself, or perhaps to tell whoever was standing on her front path that she was calling the police, which was also the right thing to do. She was brave, Damien would think about that later, but Ava had not gone to the back room. Or rather, Ava had gone to the back room and then come back, because Ava was 3 years old and had her father's complete inability to stay where she was told when something more interesting was happening elsewhere. She appeared in the doorway behind the teacher, dark curls, backpack on, barrette holding on by one tooth as always. And she looked out at the street with the focused assessment of a child cataloging a situation. She saw the cars, she saw Cole, she saw the men she didn't recognize, and then she saw the big man standing on the path in his dark suit, and her face did the thing it did. The recalibration, the recognition, the settling. "Big man," she called. Her voice was clear and small and completely certain. "Are you okay?" The street was quiet enough that everyone heard it. Damien stood on the path with 20 years of instinct in his hands and his daughter's voice in his ears, and felt the 2 things exist simultaneously for one long, suspended moment. The man he had been, and the man he was being asked to become, both present, both real, both waiting. He exhaled. It came out slower than he intended. Something went with it, Not weakness, not softness, but the specific tension of a man releasing a way of doing things that has run its course. He turned away from Marcus's car. He looked at Ava in the doorway and said, with a calm that was not performed, "I'm okay. Go back inside with your teacher. I'll be right here." Ava studied him for another moment. Then she looked at the teacher, who was pale and still, and then back at Damien, and then she nodded with the gravity of someone satisfied with a situation's management, and disappeared back inside. Damien reached into his jacket pocket. Not for anything Marcus's men would have feared. He took out his phone. He found a number he had stored under a name that meant nothing to anyone who might scroll through his contacts. 7 digits and a letter, the kind of notation that looks like a code because it is one. He had put this number in his phone 8 years ago. He had never called it. He had kept it the way you keep a structural element, not because you plan to use it, but because a building needs its foundations sound. He raised the phone to his ear. The man on the other end picked up on the second ring. Federal agents, in Damien's experience, always picked up quickly. It was a professional habit. Damien said, "It's Voss. I have something for you. I'm going to need 48 hours, and I'm going to need your word that the arrangement covers what I'm about to give you." A pause. Then, "Talk." He talked. Marcus Holt was arrested 41 hours later at his home by federal agents who arrived with a warrant that covered financial fraud, conspiracy, and a collection of related charges that Damien's attorney had spent the intervening hours helping to construct with the careful architecture of someone who had been waiting a long time to build something like this. The forged letter was entered into evidence. The paper trail of Marcus's financial manipulations within the organization, a separate matter, years of quiet misdirection that Damien's own records could now illuminate, was substantial and specific and left very little room for interpretation. Marcus had made the mistake that careful men sometimes make when they've been unchallenged for long enough. He had started to believe that the care itself was the protection, that as long as he was meticulous, nothing could touch him. He had not accounted for the possibility that the man he'd worked for would one day decide that the usual tools were not the right tools and would find a different set entirely. The loan company came apart in the wake of it. Sylvia Chen had filed the formal debt validation dispute on Nadia's behalf on day 3, sending the legally required written request that the company produce documentation proving the debt's validity, ownership chain, and original contract terms, documentation the company could not cleanly produce because the contract itself was riddled with violations. Simultaneously, Sylvia filed a complaint with the State Attorney General's office, citing the specific illegal collection tactics used during the apartment visit, the intimidation, the failure to identify the debt in writing upon initial contact, the misrepresentation of legal consequences, the unlawful implied threats. The Attorney General's office had, it turned out, received 11 other complaints about the same company in the past 2 years. Nadia's complaint became the 12th, and combined with Sylvia's documentation, the one that opened the investigation. Within 3 weeks, the loan company was under formal regulatory review. Within 6 weeks, the specific contract Nadia had signed was identified as one of 47 the company had issued using the same illegal interest rate structure. The debt was not only dissolved, Nadia was entitled to damages for the illegal collection tactics used against her. Sylvia explained this to her at the kitchen table one afternoon while Ava was napping, laying out the process in plain language step by step, because Sylvia had learned early in her career that explaining the mechanism was as important as achieving the outcome. People needed to understand how the door opened, not just that it had. Nadia listened to all of it with her hands flat on the table and her eyes steady. Then she said, 11 other people. They did this to 11 other people before me. At least, Sylvia said. Nadia was quiet for a moment. I want to know if any of them need help. Sylvia looked at her. Then she wrote something in her notebook. I'll find out, she said. The house was on Birchwood Street, 12 minutes from the daycare and 3 blocks from a public elementary school that had been rated among the best in the district for 5 consecutive years. It was not large. It had a yellow front door. Damien had not planned this, but when the realtor opened that particular door and he thought involuntarily of a crayon drawing on a wall, he'd said, "This one," before they'd gone past the entrance hall. It had a yard in the back, small but real, with a patch of grass and a fence that a child could not climb over without assistance. He had not told Nadia about the yellow door. He had driven her past the street and said there was something he wanted her to see. And she had looked at the house from the car with her arms folded and her guard in its usual position, and then she had seen the door, and her arms had dropped slightly, and she had been very quiet. "I'm not going to tell you what to decide," he said. "I bought it. It's yours, either way. Your name on everything, your terms, your pace. I'm not asking you to make any decision about anything other than whether Ava gets a yard." Nadia looked at the yellow door for a long time. "She's been asking for a dog," she said finally. "The yard works for a dog," Damien said. She got out of the car. They moved on a Saturday. It didn't take long. Nadia didn't have much, which was its own kind of quiet grief laid over the practical business of carrying boxes. Damien carried boxes. He had sent people to help, and Nadia had said she would prefer it to be him and a small number of others, and so it was him and Cole and Sylvia, who had turned up in casual clothes with coffee and had proven to be surprisingly efficient with flat-pack furniture. Ava oversaw operations with her backpack on because she had decided this was an adventure that required her backpack. In the afternoon, when most of the boxes were in and Sylvia and Cole had gone and Nadia was in the kitchen unpacking plates, Ava walked into the small living room where Damien was hanging the last of her framed crayon drawings on the wall. He had done this carefully at her eye level, consulting her on placement with the seriousness the task deserved. She stood beside him and looked at the wall, her whole gallery rehung in the new house, the yellow door house, saw the house with a yard. She found the one she was looking for. She pointed at it, the drawing she had never explained when he asked, the large blocky figure with the dark hair. "I drew you," she said. "Before I knew your name. I called you Daddy in my head." The room was very quiet. Damien Voss looked at a crayon drawing of himself made by a child who had never met him and had drawn him anyway, had invented him and put him on her wall and called him something in the private space of her 3-year-old heart, and felt something move through him that had no name and needed none. He crouched down to her level. She was looking at him with her dark eyes, his eyes steady and clear and waiting. "That's what I am," he said. It came out quieter than he intended. It came out like something true. Ava looked at him for one more moment. Then she nodded, satisfied, and walked back toward the kitchen to report to Nadia that the drawings were all up correctly. In the doorway, Nadia had heard everything. She stood with a plate in her hands and said nothing. She did not look away. 6 months later, the house on Birchwood Street had a dog. A small, ridiculous one that Ava had selected with complete authority from the shelter and named, after extended deliberation, Biscuit. The yard worked for Biscuit. The yard worked for everything. Ava's 4th birthday was on a Saturday in October. Nadia had strung paper streamers in yellow and blue across the kitchen and the living room, and there was a table of food that was real food, abundant food, the kind of table that Nadia had spent 4 years promising herself she would build someday. She had built it. Damien had baked the cake. This had been his own suggestion, offered one evening with a confidence that had not survived contact with the actual task. The cake was structurally sound in most areas. It leaned slightly to the left. The frosting, applied with the same precision Damien brought to everything, had still somehow produced an outcome that looked less like decoration and more like an abstract negotiation. Ava had examined it with her head tilted and announced that it was the best cake she had ever seen. Nadia had turned away to hide her expression, which was the one she got now sometimes, the one that she didn't have full control over, that appeared when she wasn't guarding against it. They were working on it, slowly, at her pace. He had not asked for anything, had not pushed for anything, had shown up and been consistent and let her set every condition. It was the hardest exercise in restraint of his life, and he had engaged in some genuinely demanding exercises in restraint, but it was the right kind of hard, the kind where you can feel it working. Ava wore a paper crown that Nadia had made. She ate 2 pieces of the lopsided cake and declared both of them excellent. She ran in the yard with Biscuit until she was pink-cheeked and breathless. She received exactly the presents she had requested: a craft set, 3 books, a toy that made a sound Damien was already certain he would be hearing in his sleep. At the end of the afternoon, when the streamers were slightly wilted and the table was destroyed and Biscuit was asleep in a patch of sunlight on the floor, Ava climbed onto the couch next to Damien. She reached up. She put both small hands on either side of his face, sticky from frosting, warm, completely certain, and she pressed her nose to his and looked at him from a distance of approximately 2 inches with her serious dark eyes. "You're my daddy," she said. "I decided." The most dangerous man on the East Coast looked at his daughter's face 3 years old and turning 4 and full of a trust he intended to spend the rest of his life being worthy of. "Yes," he said. "I am." From across the room, Nadia watched the 2 of them, the tattooed man and the small girl with the paper crown and the sticky hands, and felt the last of the wall come down. Not dramatically, not all at once, just quietly, finally, like something that had been ready to let go for a while and had only been waiting for the right moment. She picked up a streamer from the floor. She walked to the couch. She sat down beside them, and outside, through the window, the afternoon light fell across the yellow door. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine, so do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.